Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos, and today we're going to be taking a look at the poetic genius of holoadvent. So last week we looked at Shiori's new song, and I thought as a result it'd be fun to check out the song Prisoner, which was released on August 31st, 2025. The lyrics were written by Steph, so it's important to remember that, we're discussing this as being the poetic genius of holoadvent, but that's more in the sense that it's a holoadvent project, sort of like a collective sense. But the lyric credits go to Steph. And so this one, though, has multiple performing artists, which is a first for this channel. So we got Shiori Novella, Narissa Ravencroft, Koseki Biju, Fuwawa Abyssguard, and Mokoko Abyssguard. And so yeah, I'm really excited about this one because it has a lot of imagery about prisons, prisoners, dungeons, isolation, and all that stuff. And my favorite movement within poetry is the English Romantic movement, and a lot of that writing is anti-prison, anti-isolation, and it's all about going out in nature and having community and kind of connecting with the natural world. And as a result, dungeons and prisons are pretty much the exact opposite of that. It's all stone, it's artificial, it's isolating, all that stuff. So I think we'll have a lot to discuss today. All right, so some things to keep in mind. As always, I like to give a little general disclaimer, basically just stating that, this channel celebrates the idea of the death of the author. And what that means is basically once a piece of writing is published, when it comes to sort of discourse of discussing what that piece of writing means to you and your interpretation. Your own interpretation is valid. You can't really reject someone's interpretation based solely on author's intent. It's always helpful to consider that intent, but it's sort of acknowledging that everyone who comes to a piece of writing has, a totally different world experience, may have read different pieces of media, so they're going to make different connections than other people. And the death of the author basically states that all of those interpretations are valid. And as always, I like to give a bit of further reading. Basically, if you like this track, here's some poems you might enjoy as well. So, The Dungeon by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This one, really goes into what I discussed earlier about how it's basically like a thesis statement stating that the best way to reform prisoners would actually to put them in the natural world, have them work on tangible, natural things. So working on a farm, for example. And it's the belief that that would actually be, more helpful when it comes to reforming someone than just effectively torturing them by locking them away in a, cold, stony prison. And then there's The Prisoner of Chillon by Lord Byron. This is a narrative poem, and it's also about someone getting sort of imprisoned for sort of, not exactly valid ways. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it also has all these themes about isolation and the prison system and things like that. So if you want a narrative poem that's a bit longer, definitely check out that one. All right, and so with that all being said, I think we can jump into the close reading. As always, we're going to kind of follow a system of reading the passage, then looking for rhyme scheme, and then after that, just going line by line to identify different poetic techniques and devices, such as a metaphor, simile, imagery, tone, etc. All right, so all that preamble sort of done, let's jump right into it. So right from the get-go, we get this intro, which goes, "Locked away when nightmares keep you awake, you'll be safe within my crushing embrace. You're all mine, you'll never escape. You're all mine, all mine." As for rhyme scheme, there's not a necessarily clear pattern. We have some similar sounds with embrace and escape. There's the similar C sounds and sort of that S sound that comes from them, but they're not clear rhymes. And then we have some repeating sounds with the all mine, but that's just repetition rather than rhyme scheme. So if we actually get into the actual passage, there's already a lot of interesting stuff going on. So as we can see from this sort of note, this is being performed by the whole cast. Then we got Fuomoko and Shiori Novella. So looking at our sort of context and our sort of context clues, we know that these characters are actually prisoners who escaped rather than being the prison itself. However, this passage seems to actually be coming from the POV of the prison. But since that's not necessarily clear, especially again since this performance is coming from these people, we have to ask ourselves, is this voice the prison? Is it their sort of sense of it? So is basically what I mean by that is it Fuomoko projecting this voice onto the prison? Or are they repeating things that they heard the prison say? And why that's important is we sort of get some connotation within some of the adjectives that are being used. And depending on who's actually projecting those adjectives onto these phrases, we're told a lot. So what I mean by that is, for example, crushing embrace. Well, crushing embrace sounds negative, if you wanted to describe an embrace as being like a nice hug from a friend, the classic expression is a warm embrace, something like that, or a comforting embrace. A crushing embrace, even though we sometimes talk about, oh, they hugged them so tightly it crushed them, this seems to have a negative connotation, especially with the sort of paradox here of or I guess contradiction rather than paradox, but saying you'll be safe within my crushing embrace. Well, crushing embrace sounds like it's going to hurt you. So again, is it Fuomoko and Shiori Novella, are they the ones saying, oh, the prison's embrace is crushing, and they're fakely putting on the voice of the prison? They're, imitating the prison, be like, oh, you'll be safe within my crushing embrace. Or is it the prison that's speaking and we're just getting those lines performed by Fuomoko and Shiori Novella? And basically what matters there is, if that's the case, then we know that the prison has a sort of personality of being, it's mocking, and it's sort of like it knows it's harmful. And it's almost threatening them. So it's sort of like, oh, come over here and I'll crush you in my embrace. If you can see what I mean, if the prison's saying that, then we know that the prison thinks of itself as being this sort of harmful, and it sees itself as being antagonistic to its prisoners. But if it's the prisoners putting that on, then the prisoners just view the prison as antagonistic, but the prison might be indifferent and not actually personified. Sort of going on a little too long on that part, but I think it's going to be important for the rest of this whole piece, so I wanted to really highlight that. And then we get, sort of just a possessive voice of the you're all mine, you're all mine, you'll never escape. What's interesting about the you'll never escape is it sort of goes to the idea that whoever is saying this, i.e. the prison, or almost the prison warden, if you will, when they're saying you'll never escape, it's implied that they know that the person in the prison wants to escape. If you and your friend are hanging out at an arcade and you're both having a wonderful time, you would never tell your friend, oh, by the way, you'll never escape. Or alternatively, the staff there wouldn't be saying like, oh, by the way, if you're thinking about escaping, I wanted to remind you that you'll never escape, because there isn't that context. So pretty much as I said there, the kind of unspoken part is, if you're thinking about it, don't, because you're not going to escape. So we know that this prison knows that the prisoners view it as antagonistic. The "You're All Mine" is interesting because usually with prisons, when we talk about this sort of thing, it's sort of more as like a cold, dark, dungeon-esque thing where it's sort of indifferent and it's just somewhere for a criminal to sort of like rot away, especially like in poetry and fiction and stuff like that. You can picture like an old medieval king's dungeon type thing. However, we don't normally think of this sort of possessiveness, and I think that possessiveness is really interesting here. A warden in a sort of prison story like Shawshank Redemption or something like that might sort of antagonistically mock someone for not escaping, but it's more like they're like, I like seeing you, sort of suffer and be miserable, and I'm gonna mock you by being like, oh, and by the way, you're gonna be here forever. But there's not usually this like, you're all mine, because by saying you're all mine, it's almost implying that they're somehow almost jealous of someone else, and they're almost like a possessive romantic partner who's, like, oh, I don't want you to talk to other people, and I'm not going to let you leave the house to go talk to others because you're all mine. And like that mine has a sense of like ownership and again like possessiveness, which is very interesting in a prison thing. So again, that was sort of a lot, but as we go into it, I sort of want to see more of this. Are we going to get more revealed about how this prison is sort of almost obsessed with its prisoners? And again, who's really delivering these lines? So then we get our first verse, which goes, "Wayward soul, I'll wrap you up in darkness that consumes you whole, hold you in my labyrinth of walls, lost in the depths that swallow you, where just your shadows follows you, always churning in the deep, I won't let you sleep." So then, as for the rhyme scheme here, we get soul and whole, you and you, deep and sleep. And this is sort of a perfect example of why I always like to try to highlight rhyme scheme, because here's something's really, really interesting is going on with this. So we have our sort of A rhyme, which is soul and whole. Then we got our B rhyme, which is an exact rhyme of you and you. And then we get deep and sleep. So with rhyme in poetry, rhyme is musical, and it's sort of satisfying to the ear to hear rhyme. At times, when it's overdone, it can seem sort of sing-songy and almost like overly positive. So like if you wanted to write like a very serious poem about the death of a friend, rhyme might actually be a bad choice because it can sort of make it sound almost like a, roses are red, violets are blue, where it's sort of like a little too sing-songy. So what's interesting here is we sort of get this sort of sing-songiness with soul and whole, you, deep and sleep. And deep and sleep, are kind of soft-sounding words. But then what suddenly breaks up this sing-songiness and draws your ear into it more and actually sounds all the harsher because it doesn't fit within that nice musical rhyme scheme is darkness and walls, which within a prison are like the worst attributes of a prison, is that you're locked up, surrounded by these walls, and you're in total darkness. So this is a really effective use of rhyme scheme. By not having these rhyme, it really points out just how like unappealing they are. And when you hear with your ear, again, it kind of breaks it up, and then you kind of go back into your little rhyme scheme, but you're still reminded of this. And also, there's sort of a sense of it not being complete because we get this rhyme scheme later on, where then it becomes like these neat little couplets. So what I mean by that is, so your ear hears soul, and then you hear darkness. And at that point, it could still be alternating. You could get whole and then a word that rhymes with darkness. So then you hear whole, and your ear goes, this is going to be A, B, A, B. but then you get walls, and that doesn't satisfy your rhyme with darkness. So then you think, well, maybe this is going to be like a weird A, B, A, C, B, A, C, or something like that. But instead, we then get U, which doesn't rhyme with anything before, but then is immediately satisfied by the couplet following it. And then we get the deep and sleep. But while we're hearing the musicality of you and deep and sleep, we're still waiting for walls and darkness to be satisfied and to be completed by rhyming. We're waiting for that darkness rhyme. We're waiting for that walls rhyme. And as a result, it makes you feel sort of uncomfortable with these because you're sort of like, okay, but when are you're too distracted by wondering when they're going to return to walls and darkness, but they never do, which makes you feel uncomfortable, almost like you're in a prison. As for the actual line by line, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. So we start with wayward soul. Now here, wayward could mean that someone has sort of been a criminal, and that you could describe someone as being wayward, because if we think of the law as this neat path and it's all orderly and, polite and perfect and, idealized sense of law and sort of like medieval fantasy society, it's this neat and orderly thing. Well, if someone's wayward, that means they've wandered off this path of the law. And if this is order here, then that implies that everything else must be not order. And if it's not order, then it must be disorder, chaos, corruption, all of that stuff. However, we also sometimes use the expression wayward soul for like ghosts, especially with the use of soul. If someone has passed away but isn't able to move on to the other side, we usually think of them as a wayward soul who's left to wander the earth, waiting to finally have this desire satisfied that will finally let them move on to the other side. So, are the prisoners in here ghosts? Or are they just criminals? And honestly, there's sort of a third interpretation where if you add ghost plus criminal, you suddenly get a sense of hell. Because if you think of it as like hell is for souls who are wayward and have erred away from, in like Christian doctrine, have erred away from God and the church and righteousness, and they've become wayward, then usually the implication is that they go to hell. And as we've seen already and will see, this prison is very hellish. It's very much depicted almost as like the Greek sort of Hades, especially with these labyrinths and depths and shadows. That's very much like how Greek mythology depicts sort of hell, where you're not in like Elysium, where it's heavenly and nice. It's all about these shadows and darkness and sort of a sense of loss and being lost. So what's interesting, though, is then we get this owl. Again, I don't really think this is Advent saying that they'll wrap us up in darkness. It's not like, oh, we're fellow prisoners, so don't worry, welcome to the prison where we also are. Instead, this very much seems to be the voice of the prison itself. I'll wrap you up seems positive, but then we get in darkness, which is obviously negative. And not only that, but it's a darkness that consumes you whole, which is sort of interesting because we don't normally think of darkness as being something that can consume you whole, except if you were to, for example, be watching someone walk out into the night and suddenly the shadows sort of shroud them and you can't see them. You could say in that sense that it consumes you whole. However, since the prison is being personified and sort of has a mouthpiece and is able to, be saying these lines effectively, I think there is something sort of interesting about the idea of it being kind of a monstrous thing, and that the darkness is consuming you whole, like you would describe a monster describing, like a dragon could consume a knight whole kind of thing. then hold you in my labyrinth of walls. This part really interests me. From like a sort of poetry sense, because a big part of poetry is doing unexpected imagery and sort of surprising your audience. Because if you hear something unexpected but it still resonates, where it's like, that's a really weird comparison, but you know what, it makes sense. That's sort of one of the cornerstones of poetry. So at first you think, well, labyrinth of walls, that sounds, again, sort of like hell. You can almost picture, I think it's Theseus who goes against the Minotaur. Sorry if that's Perseus, I can't remember. But anyway, Greek hero going through a labyrinth of walls, getting lost, trying to, fight a monster and things like that. However, usually when we think of prison, we think of someone being in a small, tiny little room. There's a gate, that locks them in, and there's no windows, and it's all dark. There's not really, in that sense, a sense that you can wander around because it's so small. Like a person per, the size of this room would be about, this big. And so they might be able to pace just the walls of their cell. But for it to be a labyrinth means that it's a maze. It's all of these different hallways that seem to go nowhere and have dead ends and then other offshoots. And, it's meant to confuse you. So here, which sort of fits with the like HoloLive Advent sort of imagery that they've shown that's depicting the prison that Advent was kept in, it feels like there is more walking space. And what's interesting, though, is a labyrinth. There's also the implication of there being sort of an entrance and an exit, if you can find it, but also potentially things like monsters lurking in the labyrinth, things like the Minotaur. So there's sort of like a threat and a sort of danger and things like that. So, it's just very interesting because, again, I would normally think of a prison as being more described as being cramped and small and like you can't, you can barely stretch your legs because you're so confined. But in this one, they're sort of wrapped up in darkness and then able to, wander a labyrinth of walls where they can be lost within the depths. So again, if you can be lost in it, that means you're able to walk. You can't get lost in a room that's pretty much only a little bit bigger than you are. And then again, we get that swallows you. So once again, we get this sort of monstrous idea of this, this big mouth that's going to swallow you whole. So again, the prison is being personified, where just your shadows follow you. And then always churning in the deep. What's also interesting is with the idea of having a darkness that consumes you whole, depths and churning and the deep, a lot of these also have a lot of sort of like water imagery. We would say, the sea is churning and he sunk down in the deep. He sunk to the depths of the ocean. The ocean consumed him and his boat whole. So there's a lot of like this sense of it being like this sort of like, like dark, starless sea where it's a lone ship kind of thing and you're lost. And we can almost think of seas as being labyrinths in a way because you can get lost at sea, lost in the depths. But rather than being a boat on top of the waves, this imagery instead puts them as sort of sinking down into the depths, already in the depths. They're already churning in the deep of the sea, not the surface of the sea. And then again, we just get a sort of just purely antagonistic line, which is, I won't let you sleep. So again, we have to sort of wonder, so we got sort of like a lot of different imagery here. We got, sort of like ocean imagery. We've got hell imagery. We've got labyrinth and maze imagery. And then we've got sort of this other like antagonistic, I won't let you sleep. That's not something we normally associate with, seas and sea monsters or really hell or monsters. It's not like there's a lot of monsters where it's like, oh, they don't let you sleep. Of course there are some, but it's not a very common thing that we would also associate with prison stuff. That being said, if you think of it again as closer to hell, a lot of that does make more sense because, you know, hell is a constant state of discomfort and of agony and suffering. So if you can't sleep, that's obviously, you know, sort of mental torture in a way. And so, you know, there's definitely something going on there where you could also then attribute some of these images. Labyrinth of walls, all of that, Greek hell. Churning in the deep and the shadows and the depths. You can have the depths of hell. A lot of people actually use that as sort of a phrase of like, you know, oh, go to the furthest depths of hell, or you can find that thing in the furthest depths of hell. So hell sometimes is almost sort of described in a sort of not watery way, because it's usually like a sea of fire and lava, but there is that sense of depths and sort of like it almost being kind of cave-like, which actually kind of fits in with the whole labyrinth thing. If you think of this sort of hell as being, you know, a bunch of labyrinth of walls, of being more of the depiction of hell where it is sort of like a dark cave that you have to walk through rather than just being purely like a sea of fire, a lot of this imagery works. But who is this eye? Is the eye the prison? Is it literally the prison, or is it the warden? As a side note, as a sort of a tangent, it's all the weirder because the song is like, the eye in the song is so evil that it's sort of interesting that the lore is that Hololive Justice kind of kept them in prison and sort of like monitored them, and then Advent broke out and then Justice pursued them, because if Justice is not letting them sleep and putting them in the depths of shadows that consumes them whole in a labyrinth of walls and all that stuff, that greatly contradicts our image of justice. That being said, that's where I almost wonder if this could be, rather than actual quotes from the prison of a personified prison, if it's more how Advent viewed the prison. Because if they are like, oh yeah, justice won't let you sleep, they're probably laughing at us right now saying, oh, I'm gonna throw you in a labyrinth, and, you know, like they have this sort of like bitter where they're projecting things onto them, like, oh, the warden never lets us sleep, I bet he's, you know, just sitting in his office laughing at us right now, that kind of vibe. Especially also when you consider the fact that like Nerissa Ravencroft is part demon, so we got this hell imagery. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I think we should jump to the next passage though to sort of see how these ideas proceed to develop. So now we have our pre-chorus, which goes, "You don't need your dreams now that you belong to me. Throw them all away, you're too frail to be free. You will always be." As for rhyme, we have kind of this double rhyme where there's me, free, and then this sort of in parentheses other voice, or like almost aside, that also rhymes. And again, here we get this interesting kind of possessive sense that we saw in the first part where it says, you're all mine, you're all mine. You know, now that you belong to me, you're too frail to be free, you will always be. There's a lot of interesting stuff. So that you belong to me, but it's now that you belong to me, which almost implies that the prison wanted this before and was almost fighting for it. And it's sort of like, now that I've captured you, now that you belong to me, I'll give away all your dreams and stuff. But there's also this interesting thing of the prison seems to think that it knows Advent or its prisoners really well. Because it's saying things like, you're too frail to be free, you don't need your dreams, throw them all away. So it seems to think like it knows that they have dreams, but then it's claiming to know that they're too frail to be free. This is also extremely interesting. to be free, so that means to be free from the prison, but it's saying you're too frail, not too corrupt, not too much of a criminal, not too dangerous, because normally the mentality is that, oh, we have to lock away these criminals because they're too dangerous to be, set free. But here it's you're too frail to be free. So there's this really interesting, but sort of also at the same time bizarre sort of voice of this prison, which is sort of, it's possessive. It's also, though, antagonistic and negative and condescending. But also, there's something weird about, you don't need your dreams. The need thing, it's interesting because, as we always say in these, when you only have so many words, because in a novel and you have thousands and thousands of words, you can technically be a little bit more chill with your word choice. Great novels still, interrogate every word and make sure it's the perfect word to be used and all of that, but it's a bit more chill in that sense. When you have only, though, a few lines, if you only have a few verses, a few stanzas, and all those stanzas are very small, you have to be so precise with your word choice. And as a result, we have to kind of look at every word and see then what is really implied or meant by that word choice, because clearly it, made it to the final cut. So what's interesting to me about need is it's not saying give up on your dreams now that you belong to me, because you belong to me, you'll never have the chance to fulfill your dreams. It's saying you don't need them. And needing a dream versus wanting to pursue a dream is very, very different. Because again, it's not saying you've lost your opportunity, because you wouldn't say, oh, now that you've lost your opportunity to become a rock star, you don't need the dream of becoming a rock star. That's a very weird phrase. Instead, you would say, oh, now that you blew that talent show, you might as well give up on your dreams of becoming a rock star. You wouldn't say you don't need it. So instead, it's almost like the prison is wanting to sort of fill the slot that is currently being filled by dreams. So if you have your heart, and this part of your heart is, is your dreams, this is family, you know what I mean? It's friends. And so you have all these different almost puzzle piece slots. It's almost like the prison is saying, well, you don't need your dreams anymore, so empty that part of your heart now that you belong to me, which is almost implied of then it's that way I can go in that slot now that it's empty. Now that you've removed dreams from that slot, from that bookshelf kind of hole, I can now put, myself as an entity in that. And it's kind of interesting and weird to think of a prison as wanting to occupy that space within your heart. It doubles down on it. It's almost like a very weird analogy, but follow me on this. If you had a teddy bear that you always had in your bed while you slept, and then suddenly you have this romantic partner who comes in, and because the teddy bear is taking up, the other side of the bed, and therefore it's taking up the other pillow, it almost feels like it's that type of voice where it's basically being oh, you don't need that teddy bear anymore, you have me. And then it's almost you resist it, and you're well, no, I don't want to throw away my teddy bear. And they're no, throw them all away. So it's this doubling down of it, where initially we just get, oh, you don't need it, and then it's much more assertive. It's not just that you don't need it, it's that you should throw them all away. It's very weird. I'm trying to sort of get to the bottom of what that really means, where almost again in that sense the prison is this jealous boyfriend wanting you to throw away the teddy bear, but the teddy bear in this example is your hopes and dreams. But then again, very interesting that we have the you're too frail to be free, because I read this line as being mocking. It's sort of like, again, if someone's like, oh, maybe I'll go do this talent show. I like singing. Maybe I'll go there and maybe I'll win. And then this much more negative person is saying, no, you shouldn't go up there. Oh, you're too frail for the fame of that. Like, what if they eat you alive out there? You couldn't handle it. You couldn't handle the criticism. So don't go on stage. It's like, it's very negative. Oh, you really think you're going to go be like a great football player? No way. You're too weak for that. However, someone else could argue, to play devil's advocate, someone else could argue that there's almost a weird, sort of twisted sense of concern. I don't think it's authentic concern. I think that would be like a weird reading of this, because the prison feels very toxic and very like possessive in a very negative way. But there's a lot of relationship imagery here with this, oh, you're always mine, you'll be mine, you belong to me. But in a sort of like, I guess, kind of abusive way, there's sort of an interesting sort of, I don't know, like twisted / like maybe like fake concern, where it's sort of like they're pretending to be concerned. Because again, it's so strange to tell someone they're too frail to be free, rather than, again, you're too corrupt to be free, you're too twisted to be free. Because then it's like you're projecting like shame onto the person. You're like, oh, we can't let you be out there. You're too messed up. But this one's saying actually like, oh, you're too like gentle and frail and weak to be out in the real world, which implies that like the real world is harsh and dangerous. So it's almost like you want to protect them in a twisted way, again, but from the world, where it's basically like, oh, if you go out there, suddenly there's going to be all this pressure and all these different forces are going to be attacking you, and you're too frail to handle that. So instead, you should stay in my prison. Which again, it's a very toxic rhetoric. I'm not saying it's a good rhetoric, but I think you could make an argument in an essay that this is sort of the prison is playing the role of this toxic, twisted partner, if that makes sense. So then we get our chorus, which goes, my lovely prisoner, are you shaking? My eyes will find you. Let me clutch you tightly. You can only be mine. Poor little prisoner, are you breaking? My chains will bind you here forever. Stay here for all time. So as for rhyme, we get shaking and breaking, and then we get time and mine. They're not perfect because this is an ME sound and mine is an NE sound, but they're very similar. And then prisoner, forever, those don't rhyme. Visually, you could say the ER might seem sort of like it's a sight rhyme, but it's not really one. We get prisoner and prisoner here, however. We get my lovely prisoner and poor little prisoner. And then you and tightly don't rhyme here. But we kind of get some internal exact rhymes because, again, it's sort of more repetition with the you and you here. But that being said, I think this chorus sort of is, to me, it's sort of cementing my theory that basically this piece is from the perspective of the prison, in which the prison is a toxic partner who is being extremely possessive and dominating of, Advent, let's say. Or since it's poetry and it's an artistic piece, it doesn't necessarily have to actually be Advent. It could just be of a different character that Advent is sort of singing about, but they're singing from the perspective of the prison. So here we get again this sort of twisted, oh, my lovely prisoner. So there's sort of affection. And then there's, are you shaking? But this seems almost like it's sort of a mock concern. Like, oh, are you shaking? Are you scared? It's that kind of thing. It's not actually being like, oh, my lovely prisoner, are you shaking? I'm so worried about you. However, there's also sort of an interesting thing of it projecting, is because since they have to ask it, it could be unclear. So, you could either picture it in which, Fuamoko are shaking in fear and the prison is mockingly saying, oh my gosh, are you shaking? Or it could be that the prison wants them to be shaking, so it's almost asking sort of for like evidence of that, where it's like, oh, I hope you're shaking right now. Are you shaking? You better be. That kind of thing. My eyes will find you. Let me clutch you tightly. And again, we get clutch you tightly. It's not hold you tightly in a hug. It's not embrace you tightly, but it's clutch. And we think of clutch as, a very like possessive grab. If a woman is being robbed, she clutches her purse and it's her holding on to it tightly so it can't be taken away from her. So that's usually sort of the connotation of clutch. You can only be mine. This only really also triples down on this sort of like jealousy, which is interesting, because it's not just that it's like, oh, you're mine for now, as long as you're in my prison, you're mine, as long as your sentence is ongoing, anything like that. Instead, it's only mine. There can't be anyone else during your time in this prison. And then again, a sort of mocking, poor little prisoner, are you breaking? The are you breaking part sort of goes back to what I'm saying, where I think it's almost that it's not that, for example, Bibu is shaking, but it's that the prison wants them to be shaking, and so it's almost asking because it can't tell. So it's sort of, like if you were... I guess it's like to do an innocent example, because I'm trying to do these as like sort of PG. If you were hiding in a closet and then you jumped out to scare someone and then they go, whoa, you would still be like, did I scare you? So again, it's like, even if they might have seen their friend jump, they still like, they want the satisfaction of that confirmation where it's like, oh, did I scare you? Ooh, did that shock you? Did you really think that, there was a ghost in the closet? That kind of thing. So again, are you breaking? It's more like they're checking in like, ooh, are you breaking? Like status check on my progress of dismantling you, and if Advent was defiant, they would say, no, you're not breaking me. And then, the pressure would increase and be even tighter. And then they say, how about now? It's that sort of how about now sort of mentality. My chains will bind you here forever. Stay here for all time. Now, this last part is interesting because, like, okay, the prison here is definitely very twisted. So they're not thinking clearly because they're twisted in the head. But what's interesting is, like, if you were to lock someone in a room, or if you were like a normal prison guard and you closed the door shut on a prisoner and you knew that they were locked in their cell and there's no windows, there's no way out, you wouldn't like ask them, oh, and by the way, make sure you stay here. Because I don't think this line specifically is mocking in the way that are you shaking could be. Because are you shaking, again, could be, aw, poor baby, are you shaking? And it's not doing the like, oh, obviously you're locked up, but oh, hey, stay here. And then the prisoner's mad because they're like, obviously I can't leave, you've chained me to a chair or something like that. But here, I read it more as there is sort of like a twisted imploring going on here, because it's like the prison is being possessive and trapping its prisoners in its labyrinth, and it's very possessive. You can only be mine, you're all mine. It keeps saying that. But I feel like because it's twisted, it sort of wants its prisoners to want to be in the prison, because that's why it's like, stay here for all time. It's almost kind of pleading of like, and don't leave. You're all mine, stay here in my prison, and please don't leave, which is like an interesting vulnerability and sort of a reveal that is very strange. This is a very interesting song. I think we should jump into the next passage, though. So then we get our post-chorus, which is in Latin. I'm not going to attempt to read the Latin part, but it goes, in the dark, in the cold, in prison. And maybe I'm reading a little too into it, but I just want to say what this part for me, what made me think, or what this made me think of, is sort of wedding vows, where we say like in sickness and in health. Of course, it could just be saying, sort of as a chant, like, this is where we are in the dark, we are in the cold, we are in prison, that kind of thing. But I feel like there's a lot of weird kind of like relationship-esque, sort of like metaphor going on, where they're sort of making a comparison between, their relationship in the prison and like someone's relationship with like a very possessive, isolating partner. And I feel like this is kind of a good moment to, take a break and just basically say, like, this is kind of what it's all about. Because when you're doing these close readings, if you were to then do a close reading like this and then write up a literary essay, like, if you're able to truly back up your claims, you can argue that a piece of writing is about, however you interpret it, which goes back to the whole death of the author thing. So, like, if we're not going to interview the writer and say, no, the writer specifically meant, X when they wrote this, and you're trying to say they meant Y, here I think you really could make a comparison to this being sort of like a sort of dark and twisted sort of wedding vow, because, well, what's a wedding vow? What's something you say before you enter what, in theory, is a contract for life. It's sort of a binding contract in which you are forever becoming united with one other person. And then as a result, you're sort of all, you are theirs and they are yours and all of that. And in this piece, we've been seeing this prison saying, you're all mine. I'm going to envelop you in my darkness. You're mine. You don't leave. You're going to stay here. Give up on your dreams. You don't need them now that you have me. Which, again, in a way, is sort of like a dark and twisted wedding vow. So, that being said, we can jump into the next passage. Also, before I forget to mention it, with the whole wedding vow thing, it is sort of notable that it's in Latin, which is, sort of a dead language, has a lot of association with sort of ancientness, but also sort of like Catholicism and ancient prayers and all of that. So I think altogether you could make a very convincing argument that this is, wedding vow coded in a way, which is unexpected and maybe not intended, but it can be argued. All right, but with that being said, on to the next section. So now we're at our second verse, which goes, close your eyes, go deeper in the emptiness that plagues your mind. Let my dark envelop your light. I'll keep you safe and sound. Hear the blissful silence all around. I'll drag you down below. Never let you go. And here we have a somewhat similar rhyme scheme situation as we saw before, in which eyes and mind don't rhyme, but the I sound here, and obviously the I sound of eyes, they do rhyme, so they're near rhymes. Then we get sound and around, and then below and go. But once again, we get, so we kind of have an AA, I guess written better, so if you wanted to do this correctly, you would put it as A, B, A, C, D, D, E, E. And so once again, emptiness is highlighted, but also light, which is sort of interesting and sort of goes against what we were saying before. Although when you realize that the full phrase is, let my darkness envelop your light, that's like a full, that's a threat. That's ominous. So it's standing out in the way it does, just like we saw in the last passage, makes a lot of sense. For example, I'll keep you safe and sound, that we know that the prison is, malicious and toxic and all of that stuff. But the phrase on its own, I'll keep you safe and sound, hear the blissful silence all around, that sounds appealing. That sounds like it's a nice thing. Like, that doesn't sound like an evil expression. So they rhyme, and so there's a pleasantness to it. of course, the next part sort of contradicts that with the "I'll drag you down below, never let you go." But close your eyes, not necessarily bad. Go deeper in the emptiness, very bad. Doesn't rhyme at all. That plagues your mind. Well, that's sort of, if you close your eyes to what's plaguing your mind, then that's maybe positive. So, there's kind of a rhyme, but it's not a full rhyme because it's still kind of negative sounding. Let my darkness envelop your light. Okay, nothing rhymes with that. That's just bad. I'll keep you safe and sound. Sort of pleasant. Hear the blissful silence all around. If you were describing like a cozy forest and it was like this quiet day, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Oh, hear the blissful silence. Blissful is very, positive. So it rhymes. I'll drag you down below, never let you go. If anything, that's sort of interesting. I would argue what's kind of going on here with this rhyme scheme is, again, if rhyme is musical, rhyme is also sort of soothing. It's sort of like a lullaby. And so if you were to be reading like a long epic poem and it all rhymed, after a certain point, you might find yourself actually kind of zoning out a bit because your ear starts to get used to the same rhythm. If it's in iambic pentameter, you get the ba-bum, 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 ba-bum 5 times. You get the rhyme, A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D, etc. It starts to become this sort of like repetitive, and so your ear gets used to it. And as a result, you stop paying attention. So here we get close your eyes. Okay, go deeper in the emptiness that plagues your mind. Well, wait, emptiness that plagues my mind? That's a little weird. So we get a B rhyme, but I don't know, maybe we're supposed to, something about plaguing our minds, so it kind of rhymes with close my eyes to what's plaguing my mind. You're misunderstanding it, but the rhyme is sort of tricking you. Let my dark envelop your light. Whoa, wait, what did you say? I'll keep you safe and sound. Oh, okay, we're back in niceness. Hear the blissful silence all around. Oh, okay, we're back in pleasant land. I'll drag you down below, never let you go. Ah, that's all nice and musical. Wait, what? What did you say? It's that kind of like, it tricks you into lowering your guard, and then you're like, wait, you just said you're going to drag me down below and never let me go. I was distracted by the soothing rhyme. That sounds terrible. So I think that's sort of something that could, you could argue is going on here. And I think, that certainly qualifies for poetic genius. I think that's extremely cool, really cool wordplay, really cool sort of trickery with the rhyme. Again, from the perspective of who's saying it, which is this prison. Very, very cool. But now let's get into the line by line. So we get, close your eyes, go deeper in the emptiness that plagues your mind. Now this part's interesting because the prison is telling them to go deeper into the emptiness that plagues your mind. But at the same time, it understands that this emptiness is one in their mind rather than being a real emptiness. But also, they're using plague, which is a negative word, so they understand that the emptiness is plaguing them, which also, if we can trust the prison, which, that's a whole nother can of worms of the unreliable narrator, but which I would kind of argue this is an unreliable narrator because they seem very trickery and malicious. But if we could maybe trust them here, it's sort of interesting because if we take this as fact, then we know that if this is, for example, about the characters of Advent, that means that these characters, Bibu, Narissa, Shiori, they have been being plagued by an emptiness in their mind. Because remember, this is canonically also before they all become friends and break out of prison and go on to have a million adventures. This is when they were all still separate entities. So does this mean that we can now canonically say, like, before Shiori was arrested, she had an emptiness in her mind that plagued her? And also, what is this emptiness? Because it doesn't seem to be emptiness in like a sense of like, oh, this person isn't very smart, their brain is empty, like, oh, their head's empty, they don't have a brain, that kind of thing. It seems to be almost more sort of like that kind of slotism that I was talking about earlier. That's supposed to be a heart. Where there seems to be this sense of like there are boxes inside you that you could fill, or you could leave empty. And whether you leave it empty is a choice or not is up to debate. Could be that you want to fill that void, fill that emptiness, but you can't. So one of these, as we saw earlier, was their dreams, and that seemed to actually be a filled slot. But then the prison wanted us to remove the dreams so that it would be empty, which is sort of inferred so that then the prison could enter that slot. But there seems to be an empty part that is plaguing the minds of these prisoners. It's also interesting, again, with the use of the word mind, is, so is this being abstract, where it's really saying, like, all of this is in their heads? Is the prison itself real, or is the prison in their head? And so when they're sinking further and further down, are they just sinking further and further down into their own sort of like mental health issues? It could be something like depression, for example. Is it a prison of their own making? Or is it specifically just saying that, like, oh, you're in this real tangible prison, but I know that while you're here, inside your mind, you also have an emptiness that's bothering you. So then it says, let my dark envelop your light. So we also know that these prisoners, they have a light. They aren't just something that doesn't have light and can either go into light or go into darkness, but they themselves are the source of light, but the prison wants to envelop it and then therefore shroud it in darkness. I'll keep you safe and sound, hear the blissful silence all around. This is also interesting because here again, the prison almost sounds nice, but it sounds like it's sort of tricking them. It seems like a Greek fable or Greek myth where it's sort of like, don't listen to say like Paradise Lost, don't listen to the serpent who's trying to trick you. But also all the interestingness is that they're saying, hear the blissful silence all around, but emptiness is what's bothering them. But now they're trying to almost trick them into thinking, because like silence is, the lack of sound, which can also sort of be a sense of emptiness. If a room is empty and has literally nothing in it and it's a vacuum, it's not going to have birdsong. It's not going to have the sound of voices. It's going to be silent. So it's telling them to close their eyes and go deeper into the emptiness. And now it's continuing with that sentiment and trying to convince them that, oh, go into the emptiness because it's blissful. It's previously the silence is something that plagued their mind, but now it's trying to convince them into thinking of it as something that is blissful and good and positive. And then we get this quick threat where they've already closed their eyes and they're sort of entering a trance and they're going deeper and deeper into the emptiness in their mind, and they're hearing the silence, and they're getting further and further into the prison. And then we get this, I'll drag you down below and never let you go. So again, that's sort of like an abrupt sort of scary threat, but also it kind of goes again with this sort of possessiveness, this sort of like latching on, clutching. They're going to never let them go, and they're going to continue to pull them further and further down this sort of like labyrinth vortex of darkness. So again, this is one of the most like intriguing voices we've kind of studied in this series thus far, just because there's like kind of a super villain, like not even kind of, this is like a total villain who's sort of playing the role of a Lucifer's, kind of trying to trick these people into kind of going to hell with them, which, as we saw in our Heiko's Bales video, check that one out. There's a little shout out. We talk a ton about Paradise Lost and how Lucifer is trying to trick other humans into going into hell, so he's not alone in hell, and also because he thinks that by doing that it'll upset God, and his whole thing is he's waging a war against God. It's a whole thing. It's not biblical. It's following the John Milton poem Paradise Lost. But so if you want to hear more about that, check out that video, because I feel like we're getting a similar voice here. And then we get our pre-chorus, which goes, everything you've been, the transgressions of your past, throw them all away. Let me hold you at last. Now, things are getting extremely interesting here. So we have our little rhymes just to do that part of past and last, but we're not having it here with away, which I think we had on the last pre-chorus. But this one is just full of interestingness. Everything you've been, the transgressions of your past, throw them all away. Let me hold you at last. So at first, this actually sounds like a weirdly positive and nice line, because if you took someone, so you have your person here and they have a dark past, so we're going to draw some storm clouds over them. They have this dark past, and so it's raining on them, and as a result they think that they're defined by this dark past. And in this case, the dark past is that they did something wrong. So say someone cheated on their spouse and they feel really bad about it. And so afterwards, even years later, they still think of themselves as a cheater and as being this that's the branding that they have on them. They think of themselves not first as just being a person who's capable of making mistakes. They think of themselves as I am this cheater who is a bad person. But then we get this voice that's saying, oh, these transgressions of your past, throw them away. You don't need to define yourself by this past. Throw it all away, and then I can hold you, and you can be sort of almost born anew as a new person. Sounds really positive, right? That's kind of like Les Mis, where it's sort of oh, you were a prisoner, Jean Valjean, but you've remade yourself. It's a redemption arc. It's all of that stuff. And it's saying to throw them all away especially sounds very positive, where it's you're holding on to this baggage and holding on to all this guilt. Just throw it away and be free. Very romantic. And then there's this interesting ending where they say, let me hold you at last, which implies that they can't hold you until you've thrown away all of this stuff. Thrown away the transgressions of your past, what you were before. But here's where the twist is. That line only is nice and kind and stuff if it's coming from a benevolent person. So, a forgiving person. But if it's someone who thinks, things like independence, creativity, individuality, if they think of those things as being transgressions, which this prison seems to think, it's actually a very malicious, dark thing to say. So, if you were someone who had your hair in a cool mohawk and you had, spiky, crimson red mohawk hair and all these piercings and the leather jacket and the tattoos, and you were this is how I express myself. This is who I am. I'm proud of this. This is me. This is me as an individual. And then you meet someone and they say oh, remember everything you've been back when you used to be a punk rocker and all those transgressions when you got those tattoos and you got those piercings and you got that mohawk. Those are transgressions. You shouldn't have done that, but you did. But cast it away. Get rid of the piercings. Cover up your tattoos. Cut your hair in a normal, banal way. Then I can embrace you at last. See how malicious that is? Because it all has to do with the POV, the point of view, the perspective. Because one man's trash is another man's treasure. One man's transgressions is another man's, sense of liberty. It really just depends. And because we know that this is coming from the voice of the prison, we can see it, we know enough about the prison to see that they probably think that things like individuality are probably a transgression. If this was, say, Nerissa was the one truly saying this and not just singing the line, but it was from her perspective and her POV, then the transgressions might be oh, if you're holding on to past baggage, don't let that define you, be free and celebrate yourself. But since it's coming from the perspective of the prison, I think transgressions here is probably a much more oppressive, sort of, controlling sense of thing. It's the proverbial parent who is saying oh, you have a crazy haircut, that's a transgression. Again, I'm using kind of silly examples, but I'm trying to just keep it simple rather than getting it too bogged down. But do you see what I mean with that? I think that's very interesting, and that's why it's always so important to interrogate what you're hearing, and also to remember like the context and who's saying what and what the POV is and all of that, because at first you're kind of like, man, maybe the prison ain't so bad, and then you realize this is actually like very, very, very bad. So here we've got this now modified chorus, which goes, my lovely prisoner, what's the matter? You're never leaving, you are mine forever. Got to keep you right here. Poor helpless prisoner, did you shatter? Why are you grieving your ambitions? Let them disappear. And what's sort of interesting about this one in terms of rhyme scheme, that's different than what we've seen before. So like, for example, prisoner and forever don't rhyme. Prisoner and ambitions don't rhyme. But matter and shatter and disappear and here do rhyme, which gives us an AA or an ABAB rhyme scheme. So that's interesting that it's these voices that are sort of rhyming with themselves, which feel like I said, like asides, because you had like, my lovely prisoner. And then there's almost the real voice where it's saying, what's the matter? You're never leaving. You are mine forever. Got to keep you right here. See how they're like asides? And so what they're actually saying in a line by line basis is, my lovely prisoner. Again, it's sort of almost reminds you of Gollum, where it's like, my precious, my lovely. It's sort of like a false compliment in that sense. What's the matter? You're never leaving. You're mine forever. Again, just super possessive. Got to keep you right here. It almost feels like here they're almost like reminding themselves, which kind of goes into the whole sort of obsessive. Again, it's actually very kind of Gollum-esque, where it's like, no, I got to keep you right here. Can't like take a moment's break or like a moment's lapse in judgment. Gotta, stay alert. Poor helpless prisoner. And then it's mocking here. Did you shatter? Again, it's sort of like asking, where it's sort of like, did that hurt? Did I scare you? You punch someone. Oh, yeah. Did that hurt? Or you jump out from closet and scare them. Oh, did I scare you? You're kind of like, you're asking for confirmation to see if you're like your attack worked, if that makes sense. And then, why are you grieving your ambitions? Let them disappear. This part's very interesting because it seems like, well, one, there's just so much to cover here, but one, them saying, why are you grieving your ambitions, actually tells us that the prisoners are grieving their ambitions. So we now can almost picture that the POV of the prison is watching the prisoner as they're crying and grieving their ambitions. So they're then, by saying it as this, they're telling us that, show don't tell. And then we get this sort of interesting thing again, which is a callback to the whole like, throw your dreams away and empty that slot up. They seem obsessed with specifically having the prisoners give up their ambitions. There's something about the prisoners having ambition in that sense that like bothers them and is really bugging them, and they want them to give up specifically ambition. So going back to that pre-chorus where that was performed by Koseki Biju, where it's basically saying, oh, give up on your transgressions, cast all of that away, and then I can embrace you. I would say that the transgression that the prison is talking about is having ambition. It views having dreams and ambitions as being transgressions, and it wants you to forget all about those dreams, forget about the dreamer you were in the past, and then that way I can embrace you. Because therefore, it almost feels like it sees dreams as being a threat. And by being a threat, what I mean is that it's a threat to its ability to, keep someone captured. So it's basically like, if you're in the cell, if you're in the labyrinth and you're all locked up, but if you still have ambition and you still have the ability to dream, one day you're going to break out. You're going to be able to, go to what we see in Genesis, the other track, and we can see Advent escape. But if they give up on those dreams, then they'll relent, because the dreams is what's going to keep them wanting to leave. I have to get out of here. I have to get out of here because then I can pursue my dreams. But if you don't have those dreams anymore, eventually you'll be like, what's the point in leaving? I guess I'll just stay here. And that's how the prison truly captures you. And then we get this bridge which goes, I can hear your plea reaching desperately, but I'll never ever set you free. Stay with me. And here, all of these rhyme: plea, desperately, free, and me. So we get an A rhyme scheme. And what that does, interestingly, is that's sort of an interlocked rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme itself is sort of like the prison. There's no variety. It's 4 walls. Wall A, wall A, wall A, wall A, and they all lock together to make an interlocked rhyme scheme. So here's, they're saying, I'll never ever set you free. Here, this is the moment where you really hear like the gate in the prison close that you always hear in movies, where it's like ching, and then you hear like the little buzz of the gate being fully locked up. Because here they're also asserting, like, I can hear your plea. I'm fully aware of the fact that you want to leave. I'm fully aware of the fact that you're reaching desperately. But, which is doubling down, but despite the fact that I know those things, I'll never set you free. Because you could almost be like, oh, well, maybe before, since the prison was so obsessed with the prisoner, it didn't even realize that the prisoner didn't want to be there. It kept saying like, oh, let me envelop you in darkness, sink further down, close your eyes, give up your dreams. Maybe the prison previously thought that's what the prisoner wanted. And therefore the prisoner could have some hope where they're like, oh, all I have to do is explain that I don't want this, and then they'll set me free. But here the prison is saying, I've known all along that you've been desperate to leave. I can hear you pleading. I'm ignoring it because I will never ever set you free. Stay with me. And again, sort of interesting last note is to stay with me. Is it a command or is it a request? I feel like stay with me specifically has a connotation of feeling more like a request. Is it a kind request? No. Is it a toxic request? Yes. But it is weirdly, in a twisted way, a request. Because otherwise, a command would be more like stay right there, or stay in your cell, stay in your prison, something like that. But stay with me feels almost more like, hey, you're pleading to leave, you're pleading to leave, but I'm not going to leave you free, so please stay with me, because there's no point in trying to run, so why make this hard, kind of thing. Very twisted and dark, but also, from a close reading perspective, very interesting. So here we get the final passage of the song, which is 2 repeated parts from earlier in it. We get, my lovely prisoner, are you shaking? My eyes will find you, let me clutch you tightly, you can only be mine. Poor little prisoner, are you breaking? My chains will bind you here forever. Stay here for all time. And then we get that Latin portion again, which is, in the dark and the cold, in prison. And this is interesting because it's sort of like this song ends on a bad note. So if we've looked at some of our other, episodes that we've done here, if we've looked at the other songs we've looked at in the poetic genius of, a lot of the times we'll see an interesting shift. We'll see someone who starts off heartbroken, but then in the end learns to just sort of love themselves and be okay with being alone. We see someone who, is dealing with struggles, but then learns to almost sort of embrace the struggles as a way of kind of overcoming it. There's just been, a bunch of different versions of like this sort of like part A and then part B. But here in this song, the prison wins in the end. So we get, once again, my lovely prisoner, are you shaking? My eyes will find you. Poor little prisoner, my chains will bind you. And then we get what I'm calling the wedding vows. And the song ends on these. And so they were said once before, and then they're said a second time, which almost feels like a vow, which is like one person says it and then the other person repeats it, thus making it legitimate. So yeah, the prison kind of wins in this one. So, it's sort of a stay tuned till we get the next part to see what happens from there. Or alternatively, this almost seems like it's sort of a prequel to Genesis, which we haven't had taken a look at yet on this channel, but I want to look at soon. But yeah, this is a really fascinating song because of this, a lot of interesting stuff with the rhyme scheme, getting this prison thing. And then the final thing I sort of want to discuss with this is it's really, really fascinating and interesting from like a sort of artistic perspective that this whole piece is the prison, both mocking the prisoner and, threatening the prisoner and being obsessed with the prisoner and, basically declaring its weird sort of infatuation with the prisoner and all of this stuff and trying to persuade the prisoner to give up on their dreams and just all of this like oppressiveness. But all of those lines are being performed by the prisoners because it's being performed by Shiori, Narissa, Bibu, Fuhawa, Mokoko. They're all the ones performing it. So it's their voices that are presenting this prison's perspective and point of view. And throughout the whole song, we don't actually ever get to hear their voices or their perspective. The only time we see them is through the eyes of the prison. So for example, if the prison's like, why are you grieving your ambitions? So we can see that Advent is grieving at that point, but we never get to hear them retort and say, I'm grieving my ambition because X, Y, and Z, or I don't want to go into the abyss. I don't want to be in the light. We don't get any of that. But through the prison being so insistent and repeating itself so much, you can tell that there is a resistance because it has to keep doubling down and repeating itself. So then you can there's the unspoken part of Advent being like, no, I'm not going to close my eyes. I'm not going to go into this labyrinth. And then the prison has to be like, no, you are going to go there and you're all mine. No, I'm not all yours. I have dreams. I have ambitions. And then the prison once again goes, no, you're all mine. I'm going to envelop you in darkness. So there actually is like this whole kind of debate fight going on this whole time, but we only ever see the prison's perspective, but from the voices of the prisoner, which is a very, very cool sort of like artistic choice. That's, it's genius in my opinion. So with that being said, I think we're going to wrap this one up. So thank you so much for sticking around and listening to this probably much longer one. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel so you can be notified when there's more of these. Kind of starting off now with a lot of Hololive, but eventually I'd like to branch off to other things like maybe some songs from anime or some other cool sort of like adjacent band groups that kind of make similar music. Because yeah, there's just so much cool stuff to look at out there. So yeah, and now, I'd like to hear your thoughts. So, this one was an interesting one because it was both sort of straightforward in that it was all coming from one POV and all of that, but there was also because it was sort of so twisted and kind of sick in the head at times, it was at times a bit challenging to truly point down and pin down a specific meaning, if that makes sense. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the song. Did you agree with my sort of interpretation and assessment? Did you disagree? And if you did, why? I'd love to hear, if you had a crazy, totally different interpretation that's super different from mine, I'd love to hear that as well. If you just have a slightly different one, all of it is just super interesting to me. So yeah, let me know in the comments and also let me know if there's any other ones that you'd like me to take a look at. But with that being said, I think I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care and I will see you in the next one.